Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. Now, as you all know by now, I love to hear the story behind some of the most successful companies in tech. And today, I have a story that's going to stay with me long after this podcast has been published, and hopefully it will you too, because Taylor Brown and his fellow co-founder, CEO George Fraser, have literally known each other since they were toddlers. Their two families used to vacation together at a lake in Wisconsin, and a tradition that actually spanned for 4 generations. And Taylor and George still make that pilgrimage each summer to Wisconsin. But here's the cool bit. From that childhood friendship, their creation, Fivetran, has increased revenue by more than 150% and more than doubled its global team, which is now at approximately 350 employees. And Fivetran has also garnered numerous awards over the past year, including the Deloitte Fast 500, Gartner Peer Insights Customer Choice, Y Combinator Top Companies, and was also recently named in the Enterprise Tech 30 for 2020. But if all that isn't enough, these childhood friends now have a unicorn on their hands too, because the business is valued at $1.2 billion as they continue on their mission to bring automated data integration to all. Sounds like it's just a HBO or Netflix series waiting to happen, doesn't it? But remember where you heard this story first. So buckle up and hold on tight, because I'm going to beam your ears all the way to Denver, Colorado, where Taylor Brown is waiting to speak with us now. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Appreciate you having me on the show today. My name is Taylor Brown, and I am the Chief Operating Officer of Fivetran.
For people tuning in for the very first time and hearing about Fivetran, it is a fast-growing Andreessen-Horowitz-backed Silicon Valley startup with more than 1,000 customers. But can you tell me a little bit more about your mission, which I believe is to disrupt the data integration industry? And also, you've got a side mission, if we're going computer game terms, of making access to data as simple and reliable as electricity. I mean, you make it sound so easy, but can you expand on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I may start with the electricity part.
Yeah.
So if you look back in time to the time when Thomas Edison was working on the light bulb and electricity was just coming out, I think everyone thought, hey, there's this thing called electricity. It's going to be fantastic for lighting people's houses and lighting the streets. And so that was the use case the electricity was built around, and they spent endless amount of energy, effort to make this electricity in this grid available and inside of people's houses through a plug, right? And the effort and the amount of do that was enormous. But the crazy thing is that after there was electricity in the house, all of these other innovations started to pop up. So it wasn't just the light bulb that folks were using. It was hair dryers, and it was vacuum cleaners, and it was, then microwaves, and, on and on and on. And so I think for Fivetran, we are trying to do that same thing for access to data for companies. And so right now, every company leverages various different tools, whether they are cloud-based tools for, like sales tools like Salesforce or Marketo or Google Analytics or MailChimp, or whether they're on-premise tools like databases like Oracle or MySQL, Postgres. And each one of these different tools that they're leveraging collects a ton of data. And this data in aggregate becomes extremely important to businesses. And so that light bulb use case today is really around analytics for these businesses, whether they're ad hoc questions asking, who's my top sales performer or things like that, or whether there are, KPI type dashboards where, health metrics where they're saying, hey, we need to make sure we keep our, net margins at 80%. And so all of these things are what businesses need today to be successful and to compete, frankly, with all of the other businesses around them. So in a way, in our belief, data is kind of the next evolution. Like it was kind of software, and now it's data that is really going to drive the innovation of every single company on the planet. And so Fivetran is just trying to and working hard to make that access to data as simple and reliable as electricity, like plugging into the house, right? So the company's the house, we are the electricity into it, loading their data. And I think the cool thing is that we've already started to see a lot of innovation happening after we're delivering this data, more than just around analytics. So they're using it for AI, ML. They're using it for algorithms that are surfacing various better shopping lists for folks, or better recommendations, or things like this, which is just extremely fun to watch. So I don't know if that gives you good insight there, Neil.
It does. I was going to ask, hopefully you didn't fail 10,000 times like Edison did when creating that light bulb.
Well, we definitely had a long journey. There was a lot of building in the garage, similar to Edison, about almost 2 years. So I don't know if it was 10,000, but there were definitely a lot of fails to get to this point.
Love it. And I also read that you and your fellow co-founder have literally known each other since you were toddlers. So I've got to ask, can you share that story and what put you both on this journey and help you get where you are today? Because I've not heard anything like this before.
Yeah, it's definitely kind of a unique situation. So if you actually jog back to even before we were toddlers, our families were Chicago families in the 1920s, and our great-great-grandparents knew each other. And together, them plus a couple other families bought some old logging land up in Wisconsin and put some cabins on that land. And those cabins still stand today, and that land is still somewhat owned by the same set of families. And so every summer we would go up there, even though George, my co-founder and our CEO, is from New York and I'm from Colorado. We would go up there every summer, and it's kind of like a fun camp to go to. And that's really where I built my relationship with him. George is, I would say, a little bit more of a brainiac. So he spent a lot of his time fishing and reading. I was actually a little bit closer to his little brother. We were more into, water sports and getting in lots of trouble. But we kind of built this relationship, and our parents knew each other, our grandparents knew each other, our great grandparents knew each other. And so we both moved to San Francisco around the same time. And he was working for a biotech startup, and I was working for a tech startup. And both of us really wanted to start a company. I think for him, his grandfather had started his own company and was a big role model for him. And for me, both of my parents, my mom's an artist and my dad also has his own business. And so I had always really just wanted to be, have my own independent business. And so we joined forces, and we decided to tackle the problem of making access to data a little easier, and we're able to actually make it a lot easier. But that was back in 2012. The funny story there is that actually when we moved to San Francisco, the two of us tried to get an apartment together to be roommates. And we tried for about 6 months. And I don't know how well the San Francisco real estate, or at least before the COVID era, it was extremely hard to get apartments. And so we actually failed at that. We couldn't get an apartment together. We tried for about, I think, 6 to 9 months. And I'm just glad that us starting a business together was a lot more successful than that.
Yeah. And I've heard a lot recently of, because I think, I don't know if this is still the case, but I think to get in a room or a one-bedroom apartment in San Francisco was something like $3,500 a month. But I think since the outbreak, everyone's working from home and moving out of San Francisco now, because they're realizing they don't need to be in the thick of it all the time, and they can work from outside of the city. Is that something you've heard as well? Or? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, in Colorado alone, it's been wild to watch. Colorado's where I am now, to watch the real estate market here, because the rates have gone down quite a lot. And then all these folks who are living in New York or living in San Francisco want to leave the city, leave these cramped, $3,500 one-room apartments and move to a house. And so things are selling in 1 day or less on the market here in Colorado, which is pretty crazy, but I totally understand it. I mean, I think having a little more space in this time is valuable.
Absolutely. And I think I should also highlight that you recently announced a Series C funding of 100 million and a valuation of 1.2 billion, which makes you unicorn status, which has got to be make you incredibly proud, especially as you continue on this mission to bring automated data integration to all. But I've got to ask, I mean, from toddlers, childhood friends, to the cloud's newest unicorn, do you ever look back on just how much you've achieved, or are you the kind of guy that just keeps going forward?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks a bunch, Neil. It's been an amazing journey. I think that when we first started this company, we felt like, oh man, we're going to be $1 billion company in like a year or two, because a lot of the other companies, we went through an accelerator program called Combinator, and a lot of the other companies around us had grown at really, really fast rates. And so we kind of had this, this belief that like, okay, in year one, we're going to have 100 employees. In year two, we're going to have 500 employees. And what we realized very quickly was that was just not the case, that we were two guys with an idea, and it was going to be a lot harder work than that. So we really settled in. And I think those first 2 years of working in the garage phase were just a lot about determination and just, I guess the drive to not fail and the drive to succeed. And then once we started to get a little bit of success and we just set this bar of like, let's do 10% better. Let's just get 10% better every month. And that kind of flywheel that we've built over time, both in terms of the product as well as in terms of the culture, have really driven and continued to drive forward the momentum and the success of us as a business. It's sometimes easy to forget, though, how much success we actually have had. And I do believe that George and I started this, but it's a team effort. George and I can't run this company alone. And so, there's just definitely days I look back and say, this is absolutely amazing. Like, I have to pinch myself. I can't believe how well we're doing. And I think, I think we also just believe we're going to continue doing this well, and we want to keep this momentum going. And
a question that a lot of people ask me is, after interviewing 1,300 tech leaders on this podcast, many people will say, Neil, what traits do all these leaders share? Everyone's looking for that quick fix, or I want to just follow what that person's doing. But I often say that I think it's serendipity and being open to all those happy accidents in life. That's what most leaders or most startup founders share in common, and take advantage of those opportunities. But would you agree with that? Have you any serendipitous moments that you could possibly share? If so,
yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think it's people make their own luck, and also when something lucky happens, you have to be smart enough to recognize it, I guess. Yeah. And so I think, determination and hard work were the backbone of the first few years, and that they still are today. I think as we iterated on the product itself, we were focused on the same customer base. We were focused on companies and analysts at companies. But we were trying different things. Like, we had a spreadsheet, and we had this pivot table, and we had like a full stack tool for a while. And I think it was through feedback from these users that finally we got to a place where, we said, well, look, would you buy this? And they said, no, but I would buy this. And that was the pipeline that we built. And we just didn't even know that was the right product at that point. So we'd essentially built a full stack BI tool that had Redshift under the hood, and it had a pivot table editor, and then it had these connections that we built. And the connections were just these things that we're like, oh, well, we have to have some way of getting data into this system. And we built them using first principles, not really knowing what had come before us. And once we revealed this to the customers that we've been talking to, their prospects, those prospects said, hey, I already have a great BI tool. I already have a data warehouse, but I really need this pipeline thing. And what you've built is very exciting to me. And that was like the aha moment. Like, wow, I can't believe we didn't realize this sooner, right? And then we leaned in very hard to that. We essentially deleted the code for the BI tool, and we just launched within, I think, 3 days of that epiphany with data pipelines for Redshift. Was the start, and then it became just data pipelines, and then automated data integrations.
And for any business leaders, decision makers, and cybersecurity experts that might be listening to this today, the very concept of moving a company's data to the cloud is enough to make them start sweating profusely and keeping them up at night. But can you tell me more about how at Fivetran you're actually automating that mind-numbing process of moving the company's data to the cloud? Because it does seem that you're solving a real problem here.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely a challenging problem. Similar to the building the grid kind of concept, there's a tremendous amount of work that you have to do in order to get that data into the cloud or in a centralized location. And I think to understand, the kind of impact of automation here, we have to take a bit of a stroll back to what did people do before using Fivetran and before automation. And so what a lot of folks did is, they have these on-premise databases, and they also have, cloud-based databases or cloud-based tools like, Salesforce and NetSuite and things. And you'd have to essentially build out the connections to each of these. So you use some sort of like Python script or some sort of other script that you were, pulling data from, or you use a workflow tool that, you kind of were responsible for, and you had to have an engineering team, and you had to manage the mind-numbing piece of this. This becomes mind-numbing, especially for the larger businesses that may have 30 or 40 or 50,000 tables that they're moving from one place to the next. And so, I think in the old world, it was kind of akin to you building a small electric generator in your backyard and maintaining that. You're oiling it up in the morning, and if it goes offline, you're responsible in the middle of the night to go fix it. And that's very similar to, I would say, how folks were loading this data before. I think also the other thing to point out is the data warehouse, industry and cloud-based data warehouse offerings have just advanced so much in the last few years, which has changed some of the dynamics of how a stack someone's data stack works. So in a previous world, the data warehouses that were on premise were way too slow and also expensive for storage. And so a lot of the what folks were optimizing were minimizing the amount of storage and trying to aggregate data as best as they could so that they could have fast queries. And so in order to do that, what would happen is you pull this data out of the system, you'd figure out what business logic do you want to use to aggregate this data, and then you'd load that into a warehouse. Now, the challenging thing with that is that if you didn't get that business logic correct, you couldn't go back and change it because you already got rid of the raw data. You only had this aggregated data to work from. And so the new cloud-based data warehouses like Snowflake or BigQuery or Redshift have kind of changed the dynamic there because they're much, much faster, like 100 times or more faster. They're also, the cost of data storage has gone down so much that now the kind of optimization is around being agile, right? So instead of doing this pre-aggregation, you just take all the data, load it into these warehouses, and then you do a lot of the aggregation within the SQL layer or after that. And so that shift has made it possible for Fivetran to automate all of the move of this data from these various systems into your centralized cloud data warehouse.
As we're emerging in a post-pandemic world now, a lot of the phrases I'm hearing repeatedly is ROI on tech investments, greater innovation, doing more with less, and making data-driven decisions more. So for any leaders listening that want to leverage next-generation analytics, what are the foundational steps of a quality data practice? Is there anything you can share around that just to get people up and running?
Absolutely, Neil. I would say the first thing to do is to pick a cloud data warehouse and decide which warehouse you want to move to, and whether it's a Snowflake or a BigQuery or a Redshift, and or there's a couple other ones as well from Microsoft. I think that's the first step. That, like, if you're still using an on-premise legacy data warehouse, you are going to be kind of shackled to what's possible with that. Once you decide to make that shift, then the question becomes, how do you move over to this new data warehouse? I think what a lot of companies that we see try to do is they try to take all the data that they have in this existing warehouse and load it into their new warehouse. And I think the challenge with that is that a lot of times these existing warehouses, you only have aggregated data, or sometimes you're doing things like snapshotting, where you're taking snapshots of every single day. So you have a lot of duplicative data. There's a lot of messiness to that. And what we suggest is, instead of trying to really migrate everything over, that rather you go back to the source, like everything that you've been loading into that data warehouse, and you start loading from there into your cloud data warehouse. And you start with that, and you start with a small use case. Like you're not going to be able to move everything over right away, but you will be able to start to get success, especially in use cases where you have a lot of new technology that you're leveraging. So especially around the marketing use cases or sales use cases where there's a new marketing tool that your team, adopts every 2 weeks, basically. That's where somewhere like Fivetran can step in, and we can help you to build some of these small wins on a cloud data warehouse to start, and you build success there. And then over time, you can start to move over some of the logic and perhaps some of that legacy data, if necessary, from your legacy data warehouse.
And do you have any examples or use cases of how you're helping your clients, just to help bring everything that we're talking about today to help bring that to life?
Sure. I will. I think one of the examples that I like to use is for Square, the company that does payments. So we started engaging with them a couple of years ago. And when we first started chatting with them, it was their head of marketing analytics who approached us, and they were moving to Snowflake. And they had a bunch of scripts that an intern had actually built for them the year prior to pull all of their ad data from Google AdWords, LinkedIn ads, Bing, and like 50 other different places. And the scripts were very brittle. They continued to break. No one wanted to touch them because that intern was no longer there. So it was just this really kind of sticky, weird situation. And so within, they decided to move forward with Fivetran. Within 2 weeks, they had set up all of their connections through Fivetran, and they had completely moved over all of their logic. And they were so blown away by it that they then decided to give access to a lot of the rest of the company to Fivetran. And the crazy thing for us is that we kind of said, okay, here's the initial use case. This is a good place to start. Within a few weeks, they had gone from 100 connections. First it was 20 connections, then it was 100 connections. I think they have over 1,000 connections now. Which is just amazing to watch once you give access to the rest of the company, how quickly they can understand and leverage this for the business users to get access to this critical data that they need in order to answer questions and do the work that is necessary for them to be successful.
I think that a tech startup story of toddlers to founders of a unicorn startup is almost a TV series waiting to happen. But before we get to that point, what's next for Fivetran? What's going to be your next chapter? Where do you go from here?
Up. It's a great question, Neil. I think I think on the technology front, we just continue to do a lot of what we have been doing. I mean, building out more connections, making these connections super reliable, and the infrastructure that every company needs to use. And this infrastructure has to be faster and even more reliable as companies are trying to do more than just analytics on top of it. So there's a lot of work there for us to continue to improve upon that. I think outside of that, there's a number of really interesting new products that we are going to be rolling out this fall. There's one that's coming in September, which I can't necessarily speak about publicly yet, but I think will be it's a brand new product from Fivetran that's different than our data integrations. And it's going to be, I think, an extremely powerful product for our customers.
Excellent. And for anyone listening that would like to continue to follow you on this journey that you're on, or find out more information, or even how they can contact your team and understand how they can work with you, what's the best way of finding you online and doing that?
Yeah, they can just go to our website at fivetran.com, Fivetran.com, or they can email sales@fivetran.com.
Excellent. Well, I'll add those links to the blog post that will accompany this episode just to make it nice and easy for people to find you. So much about your story I love. I mean, after 1,300 interviews, I've never had one like this where it began as toddlers. And I'm curious where it's all going to lead to, but I think it's a great story. And hopefully, if I'm ever allowed to fly again, we'll be able to share that story again. And some of those adventures from those log cabins, I want to hear more about that too. But we'll save that for next time. But thanks for joining me today, Tom.
Absolutely, Neil. I really appreciate being on the show.
A tech unicorn that began with two friends who have known each other since they were toddlers. Man, you don't get to hear stories like that very often, do you? And in fact, after 1,300 interviews, it's the first time I've come across a story like that. And I also want to highlight that Taylor is one of the nicest guys I've ever spoken with. And I'll also let you into a little secret because I messed up the arrangements for this interview. Not once, but twice. And this was third time lucky. where we could try and jump on a call and get that story out there. And Taylor was incredibly patient throughout, and he appeared today without any complaints whatsoever and ensured we had a great podcast interview on our hands. So, Taylor, if you do listen to this back, I just want to thank you for being so understanding over the past few weeks. And that's just one of the many reasons that he's been added to my cool guys I want to share a beer with. But if you've got any stories like that you'd like to share, if you want to comment on today's story or you just want to ask me a question, whatever it is, please email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com. My website is techblogwriter.co.uk. And you can get me on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, whatever your favourite social media platform is. You should find me at Neil C. Hughes. And on that note, it's time for me to walk off into a fake sunset, but not to take it easy. Oh no, I've got another podcast guest lined up for you that I need to record, get edited and ready for you tomorrow. So a big thank you for listening. And until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.